comments and also for technical issues. Rebecca Kuglich will be monitoring the chat for any questions or comments there. And Rebecca will also be adding, thank you, Alia. Rebecca will also be adding some links in there. One is to the collaborative document. If you're thinking of any related readings, podcasts, or something else that you'd like to add to that document, please do. It's the Calm Recommended Resources document. It is a Google document, so please close out of the document when you are done adding a resource. Please also do not share that document through social media or other spaces at this time, since it's in editable mode. Once it's completed at the end of the conference, it will be shared widely. And the last link will also be to the conference code of conduct, which is always in effect throughout conference spaces and conference adjacent spaces. Please revisit that if you are not familiar with it. Okay, and now I will turn it over to our presenters. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are just going to do a quick round of introductions, and then I'll launch into the presentation. So hello, I'm Cynthia Hudson-Vitale, and I am the Director of Scholars and Scholarship with the Association of Research Libraries.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Meehan. I'm the head of the Eberly Family Special Collections Library at Penn State Libraries.
And hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Miller-Waltz. I am currently the Interim Associate Dean for Learning and Undergraduate Services at Penn State University Libraries as well. And with that, I am going to share my screen and bring up our slides. And we are going to be turning off our videos as well while we're doing that. All right, so hopefully everyone is able to see these slides. Please let me know if not, but otherwise, Cynthia, handing it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. So once again, thank you for joining us to engage with us on some things we've been thinking about on the trauma-informed organization and leading ourselves and our teams while supporting our communities. And before we jump in, I just wanted to pause and take a moment to just acknowledge the Penn State University campuses are located on the original homes of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Shawnee, Susquehannock, and Wahazazi nations. As a land-grant institution, we acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. In addition to kind of where we are, it's also important for us to kind of speak about our positionality and to just reflect and convey that to you on this topic. We really approach trauma-informed leadership and the trauma-informed organization as learners alongside each of you. We are presenting information to you that we've learned and how we are considering the research and information we've gathered. We're also thinking about it in regards to our work and are really interested in engaging in a discussion with you about how we all can apply these principles and models to our own leadership and management philosophy. So some outcomes after engaging in this session, we feel participants will be able to define trauma-informed practices from a number of different definitions that are available, explain how trauma-informed strategies can support the individuals in their own organizations and the communities served by their organizations, and then identify both practices and strategies that they can leverage in their own institutions. And we have built in some time throughout our agenda today for reflection and some good discussion kind of later in the presentation. So there is kind of a growing awareness of trauma and its impact on individuals and communities as we've seen an increase of coverage in recent media, especially in public libraries, library services, librarianship, and pedagogy. If you want to go to the next slide, please, Rebecca. Thank you. Many of the current approaches to trauma-informed librarianship focus on the individual and the operational levels. So what you see here is some highlights of some work that's been completed by some of our colleagues on trauma-informed library services, trauma-informed librarianship, and again, the trauma-informed pedagogy. So next slide. The challenge, I think, for us as library leaders is, how do we kind of foster, support, and sustain a trauma-informed library by kind of focusing on all levels of the organization. So the individual, the interpersonal, the operational, the institutional, and again, like the structure and the culture, and sort of the systemic operations. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer Meehan to discuss some models for trauma-informed organizations and how we're kind of considering things for libraries.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you all for being here with us. Advance to the next slide, please, Rebecca. So starting off this discussion of models with looking at some of the existing models that are out there, ones that come from the health and human services field in particular, and bringing into our conversation two very widely referenced models. And these come from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They provide a concept of trauma and guidance for trauma-informed approach. And the second model we want to discuss is from the Missouri Department of Mental Health. They offer what they call the Missouri model, a developmental framework for implementing trauma-informed approaches in libraries. So next slide. We'll dig a little deeper into the SAMHSA model to start. So the SAMHSA model looks at what do we mean by trauma and offers a concept that in terms of the 3 E's as they outline here, which is a helpful framing of thinking about trauma broadly speaking. So in this definition, trauma includes the events or circumstances that an individual might face. These could be actual or perceived threats of harm or neglect, both physical and psychological, experiences that impact healthy development. And notably, these events can occur once in an individual's life or repeatedly over time. The second important aspect of trauma for us to understand is the individual's experience of those events is really what determines whether it's traumatic for that individual. So a particular event might be traumatic for one person and not necessarily for another. So experience is really key there. A third and really critical component of trauma to understand is also the long-lasting and adverse effects of trauma on the individual is really a critical component. And this broad concept of trauma is especially helpful to highlight the prevalence, the pervasiveness of trauma, and really the impact of trauma on people as something that we need to be thinking about. On to the next point that SAMHSA model provides, which is really helpful, is exploring, well, what do we mean by a trauma-informed approach? And they frame this in terms of the 4 R's. So a trauma-informed approach will involve people at all levels of the organization being able to realize, have a realization of what trauma is and understand how this impacts their interactions with other people. A trauma-informed approach also involves people in the organization being able to recognize the signs of trauma, whether that's manifested by those we're serving or those that we're working with. A fourth component of a trauma-informed approach involves an organization responding to, being able to respond to trauma by applying principles that are trauma-informed across all areas of our work. And a fourth component of a trauma-informed approach is a commitment on the part of organizations to actively seek to resist re-traumatizing individuals and groups, whether those we serve or those we work with. Another key component of the SAMHSA model are 6 guiding principles that they outlined to guide and inform thinking about a trauma-informed approach. And these are reflected here and have been widely discussed and brought into other conversations in the library literature, including a session earlier in this week's conference by Rebecca Tolley, which was really insightful. So the key principles touch upon safety, trust and transparency, fostering peer support and mutuality, empowerment for individuals and groups, and also recognizing and working actively to mitigate issues around cultural, historical, and gender inequities. Another really critical element of the SAMHSA model, kind of bringing it to the implementation level, is the guidance that they outline to help inform organizations to think about how to implement trauma-informed approaches. And they outline 10 domains of work within organizations. And you can see those outlined here, covering everything from governance and leadership to policy, collaboration, training and workforce development, financing, and so on. And this framing, I think, really recognizes and highlights that a trauma-informed approach does require that change happen at multiple levels of an organization. The other thing of note to call out here is that while leadership is called out as a specific domain of activity, I think we can understand and appreciate how leaders have critical roles to play in supporting and sustaining implementation across all of these domains. The model goes in deeper. Before we move to the next slide, just to point out, the SAMHSA model goes a little deeper to provide questions, sort of framing questions in each of these 10 domains to prompt some change focused discussions within organizations. So do encourage folks to take a look at that if they want to do a deeper dive. So moving now to the second model we wanted to bring into today's conversation, the Missouri model. And again, this was developed by the Missouri Department of Mental Health. This is a model that outlines a developmental framework for thinking about and implementing a trauma-informed approach. And it offers a continuum of stages where individuals and organizations, and in doing this work, sort of progress or develop through stages of learning and growth. The model provides at each stage, outlines an area of focus, as well as specific processes or actions to support change in that particular area, indicators of process, and resources. This is a really helpful framework. So just to touch upon these stages briefly, the initial stage being that of trauma aware, the focus here being on fostering awareness and attitudes around trauma. Processes are identified that support training and learning specifically, and some of the indicators of progress include, for instance, staff know what the term trauma refers to and how trauma impacts the way they interact with others. So moving to the second stage of trauma sensitive, the focus here is knowledge, application, and skill development. And the framework outlines specific processes that support organizational assessment or developing organizational values. So indicators of progress in this area would be, for instance, trauma is identified clearly in an organization's values. It's referenced in the mission statement or other policy documents. The third stage outlined is what is called trauma responsive. And the focus at this stage is on change and integration. And the framework outlines specific processes that support planning and taking action within the organization. And indicators of success include, for instance, an organization would have policies that specifically address trauma in their services and systems. And the final stage of this developmental model is trauma-informed, and the focus here is on leadership. So the model outlines specific processes to support cultural and structural change, more of that lasting change within an organization. And particular indicators of success at this level or stage of development are, for instance, leaders demonstrate a commitment to trauma-informed values. Staff at all levels are skilled in using trauma-informed practices, and people from outside turn to the organization for expertise and leadership in trauma-informed practice. So this is a really helpful model to think about and really understand that doing this work is an ongoing process of learning, development, and practice, and doing that at both the individual and the organizational level. So at this point, I've shared a lot of content with you in a very short time frame. So I did want to pause for a moment and build in a moment of reflection here. And with the Missouri model in particular in mind, and these different stages and the idea of an ongoing process of development, do want to invite all of us to take a moment and reflect on, where do you as an individual fall within this continuum? And to follow that by reflecting on, and where do you think that your organization or institution falls within that particular model, those stages of development? So we'll hold the space for about a moment here, and certainly do invite you to take note of that yourself. If you're interested or willing to share, do invite you to send your comments via chat. So we'll just take a moment here of silence. So yes, there's an open invitation to share your reflections via chat. And I see folks are starting to add. And yes, I think just to share on behalf of myself and my co-presenters in reflecting on this, like many of you, as I see, we too find ourselves and our organizations on the trauma-aware or pre-aware end of the continuum. So, so definitely there's a lot of shared experience here. And I think also probably a shared recognition that we have that there's a lot of work we have to do as both individuals and organizations to grow and develop in this way. So next slide, please, Rebecca. It looks like Rebecca's audio cut out. Thank you for your patience, everyone. The wonders of Zoom. Okay, well, please continue sharing your reflections. We'll move on, but certainly the reflections will continue throughout. So at this point, we did want to turn now with these ideas from the existing models of trauma-informed practices to sort of turn to thinking about library leadership and explore a framework for what we might consider trauma-informed library leadership, bringing in some of those key concepts, principles, assumptions from the SAMHSA and Missouri models, as well as some insights and framing from organizational learning and develop more generally. And a framework that we offer here for our reflection and discussion together is one that we see as encompassing the inner and outer work that is needed in terms of trauma-informed librarianship. So the inner work that we need to do as individuals, as organizations, in order to do our outer work in more thoughtful, trauma-informed ways. So I will start off this part of the discussion by turning to leading the self, and then before handing it off to Rebecca to talk about leading others and leading the organization. So next slide, please. So starting with leading the self, and sort of just recognizing that in order to become trauma-informed library leaders ourselves, we need to do our own inner work in this space. And that inner work involves self-reflection, learning, and practice. And that inner work is what's necessary in order for us to then foster, support, and sustain the inner work of others, of our teams, if we're in positions of management responsibility, as well as helping to inform the outer work of our larger organization. So to dig into this a little deeper, the inner work really involves developing our own knowledge in the area of trauma and trauma-informed practices, our mindset and our skill set around doing this work, and doing that through our own lived experiences as individuals. Importantly, also, this inner work involves building our support and resources, and doing that both internally, so doing that inner support for ourselves, so we can think about that as self-care, as well as building our support network and peer resources across peers, so some of that mutual care. So some specific actions to bring into this discussion for us to think about and reflect on include, for instance, self-reflection and training and learning. So doing work in those aspects. Some indicators of progress for us in doing that work are we as individuals know and understand what the term trauma refers to. We understand our own experiences of trauma, if any, and the effect that it's had. And well, we are developing our knowledge about the effect of trauma on others that we interact with. Another important action or process for us to be focusing on in this area is around individual commitments. So really, I think realizing that doing this work requires intention, courage, bravery, and commitment to really make it a regular practice. And so indicators of success for us in doing this work as leaders is we are demonstrating commitment to ongoing learning and practice in this area. We are likewise, as leaders, modeling the attitudes and behaviors that we're wanting to foster in our teams or in others. At the same time, we're also sharing our experiences to the extent that we're willing, able, and comfortable to do so with others, and our commitments to help foster and build and support that development more generally. And then other actions, of course, are around building and sustaining our support systems and our resources, doing that for ourselves and also doing that in collaboration with our peers. So indicators of success, we as individuals would have a practice of self-care, whatever that might look like for us. We have also identified resources and allies that we can partner with in doing this work. At this point, I will hand it over to Rebecca to take us through leading others. I'm sorry, we're going to pause for a moment of reflection. So let's all just take a moment in this aspect of leading the self. And I invite all of us, myself included, to think about how might you prepare yourself to make this particular change in leading yourself in order to support your teams and your communities. So we'll hold the space for a moment again and invite you, if you're comfortable, to share any reflections that you would like to via chat.
All right, I'm seeing some really excellent thoughts in the chat here. And I'm so happy to feel like I'm part of a community of learners with you all, because Jennifer and Cynthia definitely touched on this at the beginning of our discussion today, when we sort of framed where we're coming into this conversation. But we are very much learners in this whole area as well. We're asking the same questions that you all are, and putting together this presentation really enabled us to do some of that initial research, to be able to come together as a community with each other and with our colleagues to think about how we can answer some of those questions and think about the types of things we might need from each other and from our institutions to try to move forward. Wow, there are so many great comments in the chat here about asking good questions, reflecting on your own experiences and own traumas, acknowledging where you might be, granting yourself some grace. That is one I can always get behind there. Developing talking points to share with teams and communities. This is excellent. Thank you all so much for sharing all of your thoughts and your expertise with us. When we were talking about, or when we were getting ourselves together for talking with you all today, Cynthia, I believe, said she was just so excited to learn from all of you all. And that's definitely what I'm seeing here. Providing a space for this to be a safe topic. Yes, that's wonderful. All right, I'm going to move us forward then into talking about the next part of the continuum here, which is thinking about the collaborations we work within, the teams we work within, and moving outside of ourselves a little bit. Again, we're presenting this continuum and thinking about ourselves, our teams, and our organizations. But really, there's no such clear distinctions between these areas. So certainly a lot of the work that happens with the self influences what happens with leading others. We're seeing that in the comments that you all are sharing in the chat here. And certainly this piece about leading others feeds directly into and is very clearly related to some of the organizational aspects about truly becoming a trauma-informed organization. But this piece that we have here about leading others and working with teams really relates to developing competencies and building the capacity necessary for broader organizational change to support the communities that we serve, but also to support the individuals that are working within our organizations and working within our communities. So what does this look like in practice or in action? Providing training and learning opportunities for teams. We've been talking a lot in the chat here about how much we need to learn ourselves, but thinking about what this looks like in a team setting, really identifying outcomes that are context specific and that are very relevant for the various teams and groups that you work within. Working with teams to create shared language and a shared culture of values, thinking about how that plays out in work and really taking the time to define and articulate that can be very, very powerful. Working with teams to conduct organizational assessments can certainly be a starting point. We're doing some light assessment work here as we're having everyone reflect on a little bit where they are and where their institutions may be. And then really thinking about what sorts of steps a particular team or individual might need to take in order to truly think about change within a team, change within an organization. So what are some indicators of success, or what might you look for in this leading other space, which is kind of where we're moving from the trauma aware to the trauma sensitive, perhaps, maybe even a little bit further than that. But seeing trauma training for staff throughout the organization. So something that might be institutionalized or very well structured. And this could include onboarding, new staff orientation, perhaps even thinking about what hiring looks like, although that starts moving into the organizational piece as well, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. And then there's this big important piece about leadership as well, that leadership, administration, and management is, again, recognizing and responding to compassion fatigue and the various levels and different experiences of trauma within the colleagues in a library. And again, I saw some great examples of that in the chat where we were talking about the different types of trauma that we might be seeing both in our communities and among our colleagues. So very important things to think about. So as you've probably guessed, we do have another reflection moment here, because again, one of the things that we were really hoping to get out of this discussion today was some insight and some knowledge from all of you all. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on how we might, or what it might look like, if we collaborated with our teams, our direct reports, our peers, our colleagues, to help prepare our organizations for this type of change. We discussed some examples on that previous slide, thinking about the collaborative learning, the collaborative goal setting, the collaborative mission and value discussions. But what else? What else could this look like as we work with our colleagues collaboratively to try to prepare our organizations for this? As Jennifer would say, I'm going to create some space for everybody to think and reflect. So I will be quiet for a moment, but as always, I invite you to share thoughts in the chat. All right, thank you all again for sharing your ideas, experiences, and questions. So much of what I'm seeing here reflects so many of the discussions that we were having as we were preparing for this discussion today, and really mirrors a lot of the thoughts that I'm bringing to this as well. All right, I am going to move us into talking about leading within our organizations. Even though I hate to move on because there are so many good discussion points coming up right here about what we can do as we work with our colleagues, as we work with our communities, and just thinking very carefully about what's helpful and what might not be so much. We were talking a little bit before our presentation today about how sort of holding in our minds what we know about trauma and the things that we don't know, and how it almost feels like there are some elements that are related to universal design in thinking about just being very empathetic in approaching people, knowing that we don't know what their experiences have been. But I'm going to go ahead and move us into talking about leading the organization right now. So this is the third piece here where we start to really think about entire holistic organizations, institutions, and perhaps the broader systems that we work within as well. And again, this is not wholly distinct, particularly from the leading our teams and leading our communities, because there's certainly a lot of connections and overlaps and things that need to be happening at the same time here as we're thinking about this top level of leadership. But leaders, and in particular administrators, have a critical role
in terms of creating organizations, creating environments, and creating workplaces that support trauma-informed approaches and that are really becoming trauma responsive. So this piece is about the inner work of organizations and us as leaders to review and change some of the structural things about our organizations, cultures, policies, procedures, all of those things that sort of hold an environment together, with the ultimate goal of transforming our institutions and our professional landscapes. So a lot of the things that you would think about structurally relate to some of the actions that might be taken, including taking a deep dive into reviewing and revising policies and procedures with a trauma-informed approach in mind, thinking about these principles. Overall, just reducing the stigma of trauma, making sure that we are hiring new colleagues with knowledge and expertise, or even just recognition of the importance of trauma, and for an overall commitment to trauma-informed values. And then again, a big piece of this is advocating within our broader systems. So our broader universities, higher education, and the library profession as well, for thinking about how this can infuse some of the broader systems that we work within. So what this might look like in practice, or some indicators of success that we might see, we might start to see some shared language and goals that really have infused our organizations. There will be policies that address and then include principles related to trauma, both of, again, the colleagues that we work within our organizations and the communities that we serve. Thinking about the changes to our environments and the structures that we might want to make. So again, what some of those indicators of success there might look like would be signifiers within our physical environments that they are safe spaces. And you can probably think of what some of those could look like for you. Even thinking about things like the names that are on our buildings, the names that are on our collections, the names that are on meeting rooms. This was a specific example that I saw discussed in Rebecca Tolley's book, which really influenced a lot of my thinking about trauma-informed library services. And I know she's here. I saw her name in the discussion. So if she wants to pop in and share more, I just have to make sure I give credit there, because there were so many good thoughts in there, particularly about the structural piece. But overall, sort of pulling that together, thinking about what all of these aspects of an organization, if we were to review and revise them, what this would look like to really reflect a trauma-informed approach. So again, we have another moment of reflection. So again, we will hold some space for you all to just think for a few minutes and then potentially share in the chat if you feel comfortable, thinking about how we might collaborate with our supervisors, our peers, our partners, to really be able to work toward this institutional and systemic change. So the bigger picture thinking all together. So I will be silent for a moment so we can all think. After I give you one quick heads up about what the next few minutes of our presentation will look like. So after this reflection, we have another sort of larger wrap up question that we are going to throw out to you all. And then I see some questions coming in the Q&A. We are going to hold some time to be able to talk through those. So if you have a question, go ahead and submit it to the Q&A. We will be talking about all of those as we wrap up in a moment. So now I will be silent so you all can think a little bit more about these organizational and institutional level type things and share in the chat. All right, this must be a harder question because I see fewer insights showing up. Oh, here come a couple, of course. Oh, people were delivering more lengthy and in-depth responses. This is great. So some of the examples I'm seeing here, we see one example of an institution going through a collaborative process regarding name changes. That's great. Not staying silent, but choosing battles wisely. Seeing some check-in information, that's great. Thinking about tapping in to the expertise that might exist in your community. And thinking about how important it is to establish priorities. Yeah, that's a hard one. Particularly looking at, we do talk a lot about wellness and well-being, but that doesn't always come through on the individual day-to-day piece. Interesting. All right. So again, we're coming up on the last chunk of our presentation here, and we do want to reserve some additional time for discussion, even though this discussion has already been amazing. I want to take a moment to review our outcomes for this session, just to do a check-in on what we said we were going to do and seeing how we have delivered on that commitment to you all. So we talked about defining trauma-informed practices, explaining how trauma-informed strategies can support us in our organizations and our communities, and then start talking through practices and strategies that can be leveraged in different contexts. So these were some big asks, particularly that third one. Certainly not something we can accomplish in an hour, but I hope we've made some good strides in starting some discussions here and bringing up some additional questions. As I promised, we do have one big reflection question that we sort of want to wrap up here, which is the first question that we asked you all at the beginning of our presentation. How do we as leaders foster, support, and sustain a trauma-informed library? And this leadership piece is so critical. Jennifer talked about how important it is for us as leaders to model these practices that we know to be best practices in taking care of others. One of the things that also stuck out to me from Rebecca Talley's book, which again, if you haven't read it and you're interested in this, I would absolutely recommend. But the book talks about how important it is to acknowledge how challenging and difficult these conversations can be, and being really transparent about that and acknowledging that we might not always have the right words to talk about this and we might make mistakes, but that it's really important for us to move forward, even knowing how challenging it can be and how many mistakes we might make. So I am seeing some good thoughts coming into the chat here as well, and some additional resources. That's great. Other thoughts about how we as leaders foster, support, and sustain a trauma-informed library. I'm going to go back to the silence for a moment or two, and then we will come back together. All right, I'm seeing everything in the chat, from creating a sustained leadership and organizational model so that nothing is dependent on a particular person, all the way down to creating a spam filter these are equally important, great ideas on a full spectrum of different actions and strategies we can take to integrate some of this work into our organizations. I'm seeing a lot about slowing down, stop trying to add more things. And again, this comes back to priorities, mission setting, goal setting, recognizing and setting aside intentional time to focus on this work and learning, and stopping things that don't work anymore. Excellent. All right. So I am actually going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to invite Jennifer and Cynthia to turn their cameras back on because we have a number of questions. And if you all are okay with it, oh, I don't know if we can turn our videos back on. I think that's something the host might have to do. While we figure that part out, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our questions here. We've got a handful. And let's see. The first one I'm going to throw out there, I'm wondering what the literature says about handling trauma as it is unfolding. Sometimes we can't know if it's happening for individuals, but if a traumatic event happens at your place of work or, a global pandemic hits, what can we do in the moment to help prevent trauma? So definitely a question I think we can all relate to, since we're talking about some of the global events that are happening to all of us, although admittedly, possibly in very different ways, depending on our context and experiences. My gut reaction to this, and let's see, I see, yes, I will pull back up the references slide again before we wrap up here. I will go ahead and do that while we're working on cameras. To go back to this question though, I will throw out my gut reaction, and Cynthia and Jennifer, I'll let you all chime in here as well. And if anyone among our participants has ideas here for this, please share that as well. But this is where I would say, I think it would be great to engage an expert in this area. And again, many of our institutions have experts in this work that we can rely on. And I know you asked specifically about the literature. That's something that I think I would, again, go to an expert to ask and sort of bring in to talk through, both in terms of what we can do for our staff and what we can do for our communities as well. Cynthia or Jennifer, is there anything else you all want to throw in there?
Nothing necessarily new to add or more to add, but just I think to echo your comments and thoughts on that, Rebecca, and to sort of acknowledge that, as I had shared, and I think as many of us feel, being at that sort of pre-aware end or trauma-aware end of the spectrum, I think I too have found myself and my colleagues have grappling in those situations where feeling a lack of being able to handle or respond in the moment, and the practice, given where we are at this moment in time, is usually, more at how to follow up or respond after the fact. So just to sort of recognize and acknowledge that, yes, I mean, I think that is an area of growth and learning that I and my colleagues, specifically within the team that I work, feel very acutely. So as Rebecca suggested, looking to those experts that there might be, whether it's the social work field or the education field, I feel like that would be my first go-to for doing a deeper dive into the literature there.
Just to echo, what Jennifer and Rebecca already mentioned, I think that there's, just as a manager and as a leader or a colleague, there's a lot we can do just to kind of facilitate social support too, and just kind of listen actively and supportively if somebody wants to kind of talk about the experience, or if they don't want to, kind of respect those decisions, and then offer access to information, especially as like institutions or organizations kind of move along the spectrum, like surface some of the information and resources you find as you've gone along and done literature reviews or connected with people on campus.
All right, thank you all. Okay, our next question here What is trauma training? Where would I even look to find that kind of training and have it provided to our staff? So I think there were a couple of mentions of this in the chat. Trauma-informed approaches are showing up in a number of different arenas, really a lot related to medical and mental health. But we are seeing this in social services across the board, including a number of public libraries as well. So I think depending on your location, and perhaps the experts that are available to you, it could look a number of different ways. For example, at Penn State, we have a mental health and counseling unit that I have reached out to work with to provide some very light training on trauma and mental health crises that students might be bringing into the semester with them. So Jennifer, Cynthia, if there's anything you want to add there, and again, I throw this out to the chat, which I see a number of you all are responding as well. There are quite a few library webinars and trainings on YouTube. If anyone has any other specific examples that they might want to share about what that training looked like for you all in your contexts, please go ahead. And Cynthia, Jennifer, I don't know if you had anything to add to my initial response. Okay, next question, sort of similar to the last one. Have you used a facilitator to help you discuss trauma with your teams? If not, how have you organized the discussions? Well, I think that as Jennifer shared, and again, Jennifer and I are both at Penn State, we are really at a point in our organization where we haven't had a lot of these discussions. This is something that a couple of us are talking about, but that we would love, I think, to bring in some expertise to help us have these discussions more effectively. Cynthia, Jennifer, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just chime in to reiterate, yes, in cases like this specifically, I think with a focus on trauma-informed practice, would absolutely want to engage a facilitator or expert, because this is where I feel like I too, as a leader, would need to learn and be supported in these conversations. So very careful about not wanting to do harm, when trying to do good, I think bringing in a facilitator. So just to say, yes, I think that would be something of great interest and a good first step to kind of meaningfully engage in this practice.
And Jennifer, while you're speaking, the next question is specifically for you.
I see that. Yeah. So I'll take it, I'll read it and respond as best I can. So the question is, how have we applied trauma-informed practice in the special collections environment specifically? Any wins you'd like to share or struggles you've encountered, areas of improvement and or growth? So in terms of applying trauma-informed practice, we're not there yet. So again, I think on the part of the curve or the continuum where that kind of growing awareness and learning, I think, it has become more of an issue that we're grappling with. And I think specific examples I will share that have sort of brought it both to my attention and have come up in the special collections setting, but I don't think are unique to special collections. I think our experiences that teaching colleagues have had in the classroom, utilizing special collections materials that include representations, sort of difficult representations of, historical traumas that communities have faced and are experienced by students, in the current day class, and having experiences or instances where it did prove to be in one particular experience an event of, unfortunately, re-traumatization for the individual. So it did sort of bring that to a critical focus within a particular class that necessitated on the part of my colleague who was leading that class and the faculty member she was working with to do careful work around kind of follow-up discussions with the student. It actually led to a collaboration between the two of them. My colleague's Julie Porterfield, so I will sort of share her name because I think her work in this area and her collaborations with a faculty member to respond in this particular case did lead to sort of sharing out about their experiences and learnings. So I think that is one instance in which it has come up and sort of brought this critical issue to our attention. I think other ways that it has shown up in my work and sort of has brought to my attention is sort of on the part of the team members that I work with and lead. Certainly, I think in the course of the pandemic, it has come up there, but even prior to the pandemic, I think it was something that we were grappling with and are grappling with around, many of the organizational changes and the impact that has on individuals, as well as experiences of working with different situations that have felt toxic, whether toxic culture or working with toxic individuals. So dealing with some of those residual impacts have been sort of my most direct experience. So I offer those as just sort of examples of ways that we are grappling with it, thinking about it, learning about it, and definitely sort of sparking our interest and commitment in stepping into more of this trauma-informed practice. But as of yet, I would say maybe no wins to share, but just some learnings as we go along.
Thanks, Jennifer. That example you shared was one of the ones that popped into my mind as well. So I'm glad you were able to share that. All right, I see we have about a minute left. We'll get as far as we can into the next questions. Can we speak more about how to apply trauma-informed methods into our professional lives when the nature of our work or interactions with colleagues exposes you to trauma or directly triggers your own pre-existing trauma? So yeah, it's really hard to do much of anything when that's the environment, when you are experiencing the secondary trauma or your pre-existing current trauma. So I think that there's quite a lot in the literature and quite a lot in some of the tools we've shared about that inward piece. And I think I would turn back to that leading the self component of what we've presented here to really sort of start thinking about. And I'm looking at the chat here. I'm realizing my answer sounds an awful lot like the self-care versus the organizational change piece, which is so hard because we know that the self-care and the self-awareness piece is not going to fix all the problems, that we need to be thinking on a much larger level, particularly as leaders. But it can be so hard when sometimes we end up in situations where we can't necessarily change the organization around us in the way that we want to. Many of us are in positions where we can, but there may always be things out of your control. So I'm glad that Megan is supporting here and how important both the self and the organization is. And I know we're right at time. Cynthia, Jennifer, participants, I don't know if anyone wants to share one last thought on that, because I'm not sure my answer was a very good one.
I think I'll just reiterate, Cynthia provided a reframing, and so maybe we can end there. Taking care of each other, taking care of ourselves and one another, and kind of move away. I understand the reaction to self-care. So if we just think of taking care generally of each other, I think I find that to be a helpful way to think about it. Well, thank you all. Yeah, we've so appreciated this time together, your engagement, your reflections, learning with you, from you, and hopefully we'll find a way to kind of continue this conversation and share out and keep the discussion going. Thank you.
All right, and thank you so much, Jennifer, Cynthia, Rebecca. Really appreciate a great session. Thank you everyone for being here. And please don't forget about the feedback survey, which is linked in the sched for this particular session. Thanks everyone, take care.